120,000 Homeland Security employees are currently working without pay, but the panic on Capitol Hill didn't truly set in until senators realized their VIP airport security privileges were suddenly suspended. Oh, and an unauthorized military operation in the Middle East is quietly draining $2 billion a day.
You have to understand the hierarchy of needs here. If a lawmaker is forced to take off their shoes and put their laptops in a separate bin at Reagan National, how can we possibly expect them to manage a shadow war?
I actually had 3 separate text messages from former colleagues asking if I knew who to call at the Transportation Security Administration to get the flags removed from their bosses' boarding passes. Not a word about the agency funding lapse.
Welcome to Floor Notes Extended. I'm Reed.
And I'm Paige. We've got a little extra runway today, which means we can actually follow a few of the stranger threads from this week, instead of just giving you the headlines.
We'll be looking at the sudden gridlock over election administration rules. The committee markup lasted 8 hours, and the fault lines were completely different than the usual partisan split.
We are also tracking an aggressive new push for cryptocurrency regulations led by Senator Cynthia Lummis, a Republican from Wyoming.
The hearing on that crypto bill was dense. You had members reading blockchain white papers into the Congressional Record. I spent yesterday matching up the witness list with recent campaign finance disclosures, and the overlap explains exactly why the drafting process looks the way it does. We will map all of that out later in the show.
First, though, we need to look at the spending leak at the Pentagon. Let's get into Operation Epic Fury and the constitutional crisis. We are exactly 3 weeks into Operation Epic Fury. The air and missile campaign that began on February 28 against Iran is accelerating rapidly, and the secondary effects are now hitting the floor of the House and the Senate simultaneously.
You see the strain breaking through the procedural barriers. The administration is fighting a two-front battle right now. They have the actual military conflict in the Middle East, and they have an escalating institutional conflict with Congress over authorization, oversight, and money.
Let's start with the reality of the conflict itself. We have seen 13 American service members lose their lives since operations began. Representative Mike Rogers, a Republican from Alabama, took to the House floor to recognize 6 KC-135 crew members killed on March 12th.
A KC-135 is an aerial refueling tanker. These are the planes keeping the fighter jets and bombers in the air for extended sorties over hostile territory. Without them, the entire air campaign grinds to a halt.
Right. Rogers read their names into the record. Service members from the 6th Air Refueling Wing in Alabama and the 121st in Ohio. He closed with this: "We commend their selfless sacrifice and service to our country and pray for their loved ones."
When you hear those names read on the floor, the abstraction of a foreign policy debate strips away instantly. You are looking at the human cost of a widening theater of operations. And the administration's response to that widening theater is precisely what triggered the first major procedural shockwave we are tracking today.
That happened in the Senate. Senator Jim Risch, a Republican from Idaho and the ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee, submitted a formal notification under the Arms Export Control Act. The State Department is invoking emergency powers to bypass the standard 30-day congressional review period to push through $16.5 billion in arms sales.
They are sending this hardware to the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Jordan. To understand why the administration is waiving congressional oversight to do this, you have to look at what Iran is actually firing at those countries. We are talking about hundreds of ballistic missiles and drone strikes targeting energy infrastructure and military bases.
The memorandum from the Secretary of State explicitly cites the deaths of the 7 U.S. service members in Kuwait and the targeting of U.S. assets across the region. The text submitted to the record reads, "The immediacy of the challenge at hand requires overcoming the statutory 30-day congressional notification timeline to expedite transfers to Jordan, Kuwait, and the UAE."
I want to dig into that list of equipment because it tells the tactical story of this war. They are sending advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles, Patriot missile upgrades, long-range discrimination radar systems integrated with THAAD, and fixed-site low, slow, small, unmanned aircraft integrated defeat systems.
The SS LIDS.
Exactly. They are rail-launching kinetic defeat systems designed specifically for drone swarms. What the Pentagon is realizing very quickly is that the Gulf partners are burning through their interceptor stockpiles at an unsustainable rate. Iran is using a textbook asymmetric strategy. They launch a swarm of relatively cheap Shahed drones, and our allies and our own forces have to shoot them down with highly advanced, highly expensive interceptors.
Senator Peter Welch, a Democrat from Vermont, broke down that exact math during a long floor speech. He pointed out that the U.S. is spending $4 million apiece for Patriot interceptors to shoot down drones that cost $20,000.
That economic disparity is the core of the attrition warfare happening right now. You cannot sustain a defensive posture if you are spending $4 million to swat down a $20,000 threat. Eventually, you run out of missiles or you run out of money.
Or you ask Congress for more money, which is the other half of this equation. The administration is preparing a $200 billion supplemental funding request to sustain Operation Epic Fury.
$200 billion. For context, Welch noted that figure is triple the cost of all U.S. weapons sent to Ukraine. And the Pentagon has informed Congress that the U.S. is spending $2 billion every single day on this conflict.
That daily burn rate is why we are hearing such intense pushback from members who feel Congress has been entirely sidelined. Representative Marcy Kaptur, a Democrat from Ohio, delivered a 60-minute special order speech focusing entirely on the constitutionality of the conflict. She called it a war of presidential choice.
She went right at the Article 1 authority. The Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war. The president is the commander-in-chief, but Congress controls the purse strings and the authorization.
Kaptur was unsparing about the lack of process. She said, "Never in the entire history of our nation has any such consequential decision to take our military and the American people to war been made solely by any former president without a vote of Congress."
She is touching on a frustration that bubbles up regardless of which party controls the White House. The executive branch has steadily consolidated war-making powers over the last few decades. Presidents authorize strikes, deploy troops, initiate hostilities, and then they come to Congress after the fact to ask for the funding to keep it going.
But Kaptur and Welch are arguing that Epic Fury is fundamentally different in scale and consequence. Welch emphasized the economic ripple effects hitting domestic markets. He brought up the Strait of Hormuz. Because Iran's drone attacks have functionally closed the strait to international shipping, the global supply of oil and fertilizer is bottlenecked.
He mentioned farmers in Vermont paying up to 40% more for fertilizer right ahead of the spring planting season. And gas prices are up at least $1 a gallon across the country. He calculated the average American family is paying an additional $2,000 this year in gas, plus another $1,000 for home heating oil.
That brings the foreign policy debate straight to the kitchen table. It is incredibly difficult for leadership to secure a $200 billion supplemental package when rank-and-file members are hearing from constituents who can't afford to plant their crops or heat their homes.
And Welch made it clear where he stands on the funding. He told the chamber, "I will oppose sleepwalking into a forever war."
He actually went further, drawing direct comparisons to Iraq and Afghanistan. He argued that the early military victories, destroying infrastructure, taking out military capabilities, often mask the reality of the long-term commitment required.
He used a geographical comparison that really stuck with me. He reminded the Senate that Iran stretches as far as the distance from Houston to New York, and has a population equal to California, Texas, and Florida combined. His point was that regime change in a country of that size is impossible without a massive, permanent American occupying force.
Which the administration has not explicitly committed to, but members are reading the tea leaves. If you dismantle the existing power structure, you own the aftermath. Welch was asking what the endgame is, and Captor echoed that exact question. She asked, "What does victory look like?"
She also questioned the diplomatic strategy, or the lack thereof. She urged the administration to reach out to the architects of the Camp David Accords from the Carter administration. She was contrasting the methodical, years-long diplomacy required to broker peace in the Middle East with what she sees as a total absence of regional expertise among the current negotiators.
She pointed out that there doesn't seem to be a coalition of allies putting troops on the ground either. She asked where the forces from Saudi Arabia or the UAE are in this ground game.
The UAE is busy spending $1 billion on those AMRAAMs from the State Department just to keep their own airspace clear. They are fighting the defensive war while the U.S. projects the offensive power.
The sheer volume of the State Department's emergency notification underscores that point. We are looking at $8.4 billion for the UAE, $8 billion for Kuwait, and about $70 million for Jordan. That is an enormous transfer of defense articles to push through without the standard 30-day review.
Congress usually uses that 30-day window to debate the human rights implications, the regional power balance, or to negotiate concessions from the receiving countries. Waiving it is a massive flex of executive authority. The administration is essentially saying the missiles are flying right now, and we do not have time for a committee markup.
Technically, under Section 36 of the Arms Export Control Act, the Secretary of State has the legal authority to certify an emergency and waive that review. But utilizing that authority while simultaneously asking Congress for $200 billion creates a very delicate political dynamic. You are telling the legislative branch that their oversight is an impediment, but their checkbook is essential.
That is a dangerous game to play with an appropriations committee. You can bypass the Foreign Relations Committee on the arms sales, but you cannot bypass appropriations for the supplemental.
Especially when members are pointing to the national debt. Captor noted the debt is approaching $39 trillion. She framed the $200 billion supplemental as a tax on generations to come.
I keep coming back to Welch's observation that the Senate hasn't held a single hearing on this. 3 weeks into a major regional conflict involving thousands of deployed personnel, billions of dollars, and significant casualties, and the upper chamber hasn't formally debated the objective.
He noted the profound weight of committing citizens to war, contrasting the bravery of the volunteers who deploy with what he described as a failure of elected civilian leadership to do their part under the Constitution.
The frustration is palpable, and it creates a very unpredictable environment for this upcoming supplemental vote. If the administration cannot define the parameters of Operation Epic Fury to the satisfaction of their own party, let alone the opposition, getting that $200 billion through both chambers is going to be a grueling process.
We will be tracking the committee schedules closely to see if Foreign Relations or Armed Services forces the administration to send briefers to the Hill. The floor speeches are getting louder, and the casualties are making the demand for answers impossible to ignore.
The pressure is only going to mount as those defense funds start to dry up.
Which brings us to another funding standoff, this one happening entirely within our own borders. The DHS shutdown hits home.
It really is hitting home. We are officially in the second month of the Department of Homeland Security funding lapse. That means roughly 120,000 federal employees are missing paychecks.
That includes the TSA agents keeping the lines moving at the airports. Spring break travel is starting to pick up, and staffing shortages are creating massive delays. At Houston Hobby, they are telling people to arrive 3 or 4 hours early for international flights.
Which leads us to what happened on the floor. Senator John Cornyn, a Republican from Texas, introduced a bill that targets a highly guarded Capitol Hill perk.
A lot of people outside of Washington do not realize this, but members of Congress have long enjoyed courtesy escorts at airports. They get to bypass standard TSA security screening entirely.
They essentially skip the line.
Exactly. So, Cornyn introduced the End Special Treatment for Congress at Airports Act of 2026. The goal is simple: eliminate those courtesy escorts.
Let's hear how he framed it on the floor.
Congress is going to have to live with the laws that everybody else has to live with. Maybe, just maybe, if Congress has to live under the same laws that everybody else does, it will motivate us to get our work done.
That is a direct shot across the bow.
He went a step further, saying the only reason lawmakers haven't fixed the funding gap is because they are shielded from the travel chaos they created.
He filed an amendment to clarify that lawmakers can still use public-facing trusted traveler programs like TSA PreCheck or Global Entry, provided they apply and qualify like anyone else. But the VIP escorts paid for by federal funds are gone. The bill also requires the TSA administrator to submit a compliance report within 180 days.
You can view this as a pure pressure tactic. It forces members to stand in the same 2-hour security lines as their constituents. Nothing focuses the mind of a politician quite like missing a flight back to their district.
It passed unanimously. The Senate discharged the bill directly from the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. Nobody was going to stand up and object to giving up a perk while TSA agents are working without pay.
The TSA agents are the highly visible part of this, but we are also talking about the Coast Guard, FEMA, the Secret Service, and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. They are all caught in this.
Which brings us to the actual sticking point. The standoff revolves entirely around U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
Senator Bernie Moreno, a Republican from Ohio, tried to force a vote to fund the entire department for 2 weeks to get paychecks out the door. He noted that DHS has 260,000 employees, and ICE makes up about 20,000 of them. He argued it makes no sense to hold the other 240,000 workers hostage over a dispute about one agency.
Moreno spoke about his background as a business owner, saying that if his employees were not getting paid, he would feel the weight of that responsibility. He told his colleagues, "We sit here in this chamber. It doesn't even touch any of us, and I think that is a disgrace."
Democratic Senator Alyssa Slotkin of Michigan objected to Moreno's request. She offered a counterproposal to fund only the TSA. Moreno objected to that.
The back and forth between Moreno and Slotkin was remarkably direct. Slotkin argued that the country is having a fundamental conversation about the role of ICE and law enforcement in city streets following recent events in Minneapolis.
She proposed excising ICE from the funding package until an agreement is reached, and funding everything else immediately. She stated, "Every American in the world, Democrat and Republican, understands that is because ICE so deeply contradicted American values in our American cities."
Moreno countered by asking why Democrats would refuse to fund the Coast Guard or the 7,000 Homeland Security Investigations special agents who deal with transnational criminals, or the personnel handling biological and nuclear threat prevention.
He also floated the idea of docking member pay. Moreno asked Slotkin if she would support taking $500 a day out of lawmakers' paychecks for every day the government remains unfunded.
Slotkin agreed with the sentiment. She noted that her very first bill in Congress proposed withholding member pay and travel funds during a shutdown, forcing lawmakers to stay in Washington until the issue is resolved.
Senator Katie Britt, a Republican from Alabama, later backed up that idea. She said that if members and staff were not getting a paycheck, they would be much more eager to come to the table.
But despite that moment of agreement on congressional pay, neither side yielded on the actual DHS funding.
Senator Brian Schatz, a Democrat from Hawaii, later read from a March 17th letter sent by the Trump administration to Senators Susan Collins and Britt. The administration offered 5 concessions to Democrats to break the logjam.
Those included expanding the use of body-worn cameras by DHS law enforcement and limiting civil immigration enforcement at sensitive locations like hospitals and schools.
Schatz acknowledged those points as workable, but he took issue with the administration's pledge to adhere to existing law and practice of not deporting U.S. citizens.
Schatz was openly incredulous about that last point. He pointed out that adhering to existing federal law is not exactly a concession.
On the other side, Republicans are defending the agency's current operations. Senator James Lankford, a Republican from Oklahoma, pointed out that taking away ICE funding also strips funding from Homeland Security investigations. Those are the federal agents who investigate human trafficking and drug smuggling.
Lankford also highlighted why Republicans oppose the Democratic demand for ICE officers to wear visible identification and stop using masks. He noted that agents face threats from cartels, and now they deal with activists snapping photos of their vehicles and using facial recognition apps to track their families.
And, while the funding fight drags on, the department is operating without a confirmed secretary. Kristi Noem is set to leave at the end of the month, creating a massive leadership vacuum.
President Trump nominated Senator Markwayne Mullin, a Republican from Oklahoma, to take the job.
Senator Britt gave a long floor speech supporting him. She called him a true son of Oklahoma and highlighted his ability to build relationships on both sides of the aisle. She pointed out that he took over a struggling family business and turned it around, framing that as the exact grit needed for the DHS role.
But he had a bumpy ride in his confirmation hearing before the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee this week.
It was quite the hearing. The committee advanced him by a single vote, 8-7.
It was a uniquely personal dynamic. Senator Rand Paul, a Republican from Kentucky, confronted Mullin over past comments. Mullin previously called Paul a freaking snake at a town hall and referenced the 2017 assault that left Paul with 6 broken ribs.
Paul voted no. He questioned Mullin's temperament and impulse control.
Because Republicans only hold a 1-seat majority on that committee, Paul's defection would normally sink a nomination.
Democratic Senator John Fetterman of Pennsylvania crossed party lines to vote yes. That kept the nomination alive.
The committee's executive report advanced the nomination subject to a specific condition. They require a commitment from Mullin that he will respond to requests to appear and testify before any duly constituted Senate committee.
That is a fascinating little caveat. They are advancing him, but they are keeping him on a tight leash regarding congressional oversight.
Mullin heads to the full Senate for a floor vote, possibly as soon as next week. If he is confirmed, his first day on the job will involve managing an agency where over 100,000 employees haven't been paid in over a month.
And those employees are watching Congress fight over whether they deserve a short-term funding patch or if their paychecks remain tied to the ideological fight over ICE.
It sets up a very volatile environment in the chamber, and that tension is already spilling over into our next major legislative fight. Get ready for the 2026 election rule slog. So, the Senate is essentially frozen. On one side of the Capitol, you have House Republicans holding up funding for the Department of Homeland Security. On the other side, Senate Majority Leader John Thune, a Republican from South Dakota, has cleared the floor for a marathon debate on the Save America Act,
which is an election administration bill that requires documentary proof of citizenship to register to vote and a photo ID to cast a ballot. It passed the House last month, but to be clear right up front, it does not have the 60 votes needed to pass the Senate. All 47 Democrats are opposed, and at least one Republican, Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, voted against the procedural motion to even bring it up.
Yet they are debating it anyway, and the reason comes down to the calendar. With the 2026 midterms approaching, President Trump has designated this as a top legislative priority. Republican leadership is giving the floor over to it, resulting in days of speeches that highlight fundamentally different views on how Americans interact with their government.
Senator Thune and Senator John Barrasso, a Republican from Wyoming, spent considerable time arguing that showing a photo ID is a standard part of modern life. Barrasso pointed out that you need an ID to board a commercial flight, check into a hotel, or even pick up certain prescriptions.
And then you have Senator Mike Lee, a Republican from Utah, who delivered a highly detailed defense of the bill's mechanics. He pushed back against Democratic claims that the legislation would disenfranchise voters who might not have a passport or a birth certificate immediately available.
Lee pointed to a specific provision starting on page 12 of the bill. It creates an alternative process where a voter without documentation can swear an affidavit under penalty of perjury, attesting to their citizenship and providing details like their birth date and parents' names.
Lee argues that once that affidavit is signed, the burden of proof shifts to the state. The state then has to verify the voter's citizenship using existing government databases.
Lee also drew a sharp contrast between the SAVE Act and previous Democratic election bills. He pointed back to H.R. 1 from a few years ago, noting that Democrats supported a framework that would have subjected voting jurisdictions across the country to federal preclearance. Lee framed the current Republican effort as a narrower exercise of Congress's Article 1, Section 4 authority to regulate federal elections.
And that is where he delivered his core philosophical argument for the bill. Lee said on the floor, "If everyone is family, no one is. If everyone is a citizen, no one is."
Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, a Democrat from New York, argued the affidavit process is insufficient and characterized the broader bill as a coordinated effort to suppress turnout among constituencies that lean Democratic. Schumer noted that the SAVE Act contains exactly one exception to its rules, the carve-out for North Dakota, a heavily Republican state that does not require voter registration.
Schumer also zeroed in on the bill's requirement for in-person ID verification, which would effectively eliminate no-excuse mail-in voting. That specific threat has prompted a wave of Democratic counter-amendments. Instead of just voting no, Democrats are attempting to attach their own election frameworks to the legislative vehicle.
Which brings us to Senate Amendment 4683, introduced by Senator Jeff Merkley, a Democrat from Oregon. He calls it the Freedom to Vote by Mail Act. It would mandate access to mail-in voting nationwide.
Oregon has conducted its elections almost entirely by mail for over 2 decades. Merkley wants to take that model federal, specifically to counteract the SAVE Act's in-person mandates.
The language in Merkley's amendment is direct. It reads, "A state may not require an individual to submit any form of identifying document as a condition of obtaining or casting an absentee ballot."
It goes much further than prohibiting ID requirements. Merkley's proposal would force states to offer online applications for absentee ballots and allow voters to register permanently to receive ballots by mail. It mandates specific formulas for secure drop boxes, requiring at least one drop box for every 45,000 registered voters.
The amendment also establishes comprehensive due process requirements. If a state flags a mail-in ballot for a signature discrepancy, officials are required to notify the voter by the next business day and provide a specific window for the voter to cure the defect before the ballot is rejected.
And it brings the Postal Service into the equation. The amendment requires the USPS to provide free postage for completed ballots, process them as first-class mail, and prohibits any operational changes within 120 days of a federal election that might delay delivery.
That last point is a direct response to the mail delays we saw during the primaries. Just a few weeks ago, Merkley and his colleagues were pressing the administration over postmark delays stemming from USPS facility consolidations. If a ballot isn't postmarked by Election Day, it doesn't count in many states. Merkley wants to freeze any postal changes that could trigger those rejections.
Exactly. We are looking at primary elections approaching rapidly. In states that universally mail ballots, like California or Washington, state officials are warning about the logistics and the costs. Washington state election officials recently estimated that implementing the SAVE Act's requirements for the 2026 midterms would cost between $35 and $40 million just for their state.
So, you have Republicans pushing strict ID and citizenship proof, and Democrats pushing universal mail-in voting. And then, you have Senator Murkowski. She offered an amendment that tackles election rules from a completely different angle, restoring federal oversight of state voting laws.
This is Senate Amendment 4672, and it proposes a fundamental rewrite of the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Specifically, it targets the concept of pre-clearance. Back in 2013, the Supreme Court struck down the coverage formula in the Voting Rights Act that determined which states had to get federal approval before changing their election laws. The court ruled that the formula was based on decades-old data and was no longer constitutional.
Since then, Congress has tried and failed multiple times to write a new formula. Murkowski's amendment attempts to solve the puzzle by creating a practice-based pre-clearance system. Instead of focusing broadly on geographic history, it focuses on specific types of changes to voting rules in areas with specific demographic profiles.
If a state or local government wants to change its redistricting boundaries, alter voter ID requirements, or consolidate polling locations, it would have to get federal approval first. But that rule only kicks in if the jurisdiction has a language minority or racial group making up 20% or more of the voting age population.
Or if the jurisdiction has a recent history of voting rights violations. The amendment outlines a 10-year federal oversight period for places that run afoul of the law, while also providing a legal pathway for jurisdictions to bail out of the requirements if they maintain clean records.
Here is the central mechanism for Murkowski's amendment. The Attorney General shall make the determinations required by this subsection, including updating the list of voting rights violations occurring in each state and political subdivision for the previous calendar year.
That puts an enormous amount of authority back in the hands of the Department of Justice, and it places Murkowski in a distinct position. She is a Republican from a state with a large Alaska Native population, offering an expansion of the Voting Rights Act during a debate where her own party is attempting to tighten voting access.
Senator Lee actually acknowledged her concerns on the floor. While maintaining his opposition to her amendment, he noted that her arguments were rooted in the specific realities of her state.
It really highlights how localized the administration of elections actually is. Lee is analyzing the legislation through the lens of Utah. Merkley is drawing directly from Oregon's universal vote-by-mail system. Murkowski is designing policy around Alaska's massive geography and tribal demographics.
Meanwhile, Schumer is looking at the overall national map for 2026. The SAVE Act would require states to send their voter rolls to the Department of Homeland Security for screening against federal databases. Schumer argued that delegating that authority to algorithms, particularly given the current administration's focus on immigration enforcement, would result in millions of eligible voters being improperly purged.
Which creates a surreal loop on the Senate floor. They are debating how much power the Department of Homeland Security should have over local voter rolls, while simultaneously failing to pass the appropriations bill that actually funds the Department of Homeland Security.
TSA agents are currently working without paychecks because of the funding standoff we discussed earlier. Democrats have repeatedly offered unanimous consent requests to fund the TSA immediately, decoupling it from the fight over immigration enforcement.
But Republicans have blocked those requests, arguing that the department's funding cannot be divided up piece by piece.
So, the stalemate holds. No funding for Homeland Security, and no end in sight for the debate over the Save America Act.
The Senate is focused entirely inward on domestic election rules and agency funding. Meanwhile, the administration is finalizing a $200 billion supplementary budget request for military operations overseas, hitting Iran in the wallet.
Right. While the Senate is gridlocked over domestic funding, the financial shockwaves of the military conflict in Iran are hitting home. Gas prices have climbed more than 70 cents a gallon nationally since late February,
which completely shifts the political gravity in the Capitol. A month ago, the debate was strictly about war powers. Did the president have the constitutional authority to authorize these strikes without Congress? Now, lawmakers are fielding angry calls from constituents about the cost of commuting.
Representative Dina Titus, a Democrat from Nevada, brought that exact dynamic to the House floor on March 19th. She pointed out that in Las Vegas, gas is up $1 a gallon in a single month.
And that hits a tourism-heavy economy like Vegas particularly hard. If flights cost more and road trips cost more, fewer people visit. It becomes a cascading local issue.
Exactly. She used her floor time to link the administration's foreign policy directly to domestic inflation. Here is what she said. President Trump's war of choice in Iran is not just a foreign policy blunder, but it is also exacerbating the Trump slump.
The Trump slump. That is a very deliberate piece of messaging.
She followed it up by saying, what were Trump's big promises during the campaign? He promised no new wars and cheaper prices. Well, in one fell swoop, he has reneged on both of those.
Notice the pivot there. She isn't just arguing against the military intervention on procedural grounds. She is framing it as an economic failure.
Because high energy prices feed directly into the cost of food, transportation, and basic consumer goods.
It is a classic pocketbook argument. If you cannot convince voters to care about an abstract constitutional debate over war powers, you make them care by pointing at the numbers on the gas pump.
That frustration over the economic fallout is pushing some lawmakers to try and force the administration's hand financially. Senator Ruben Gallego, a Democrat from Arizona, introduced an amendment to nullify certain Treasury licenses.
Specifically, licenses issued by the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC. They regulate the sale of Iranian oil.
His amendment targets anything issued after the conflict escalated. The text reads, any license issued by the Office of Foreign Assets Control of the Department of the Treasury after the initiation of hostilities with Iran on February 28, 2026, relating to the sale of Iranian oil, shall have no force or effect.
This is an attempt to use economic sanctions as a leash. The United States has maintained a complex web of sanctions on Iranian oil for years. But OFAC sometimes grants licenses or waivers, allowing certain sales to proceed, often for market stabilization.
Gallego wants to yank those waivers completely. He is aiming to cut off the revenue stream that Iran uses to fund its military and proxy groups.
The procedural approach here is interesting too. Gallego filed this as an amendment to Senate Bill 1383, which is the Veterans Advisory Committee on Equal Access Act.
A Veterans Accessibility Bill has absolutely nothing to do with Iranian oil sanctions.
It doesn't. But with the legislative calendar stalled out by the Homeland Security funding fight, Gallego is looking for any active bill to serve as a host for this amendment. He is trying to hitch a ride on whatever is moving through committee.
It is currently sitting on the table, meaning it hasn't been brought up for a floor vote yet.
And it might not get one. But filing it serves a purpose. It signals to the administration that if Congress cannot stop the military operations directly, they are going to start pulling levers on the economic side.
Especially as lawmakers head toward the midterms. Gallego himself is eyeing a potential run in 2028, and being highly visible on a strategy to lower gas prices for Arizonans is politically useful.
So you have Titus attacking the economic symptoms, and Gallego trying to choke off the funding source. Two different angles on the same problem.
The question is whether either strategy can actually break through the broader gridlock. But speaking of complex funding streams and taking advantage of a captive audience, let's pivot to a different kind of financial maneuver. Up next, cracking down on the digital grift.
You can see the through line here. We are moving from illicit Treasury revenue straight into the digital asset space.
Senator Jeff Merkley, a Democrat from Oregon, submitted 2 amendments to the exact same Veterans Advisory Committee bill we were just discussing. They are Senate Amendments 4681 and 4682.
They target the intersection of public office, cryptocurrency, and prediction platforms. The current financial disclosure rules were written decades ago to monitor stock portfolios and blind trusts. They do not account for an environment where a federal official can launch a branded digital token or place a wager on a policy decision.
Amendment 4681 is the End Crypto Corruption Act of 2026. The text prohibits the President, the Vice President, members of Congress, and Senate-confirmed executive branch appointees from issuing, sponsoring, or endorsing digital assets for compensation.
That covers meme coins, non-fungible tokens, and stablecoins. The ban applies to the officials, their spouses, and their dependent children, and it lasts for their entire term of service, plus a 1-year cooling-off period after they leave.
The text also anticipates attempts to skirt the rules using complex financial instruments. The language bans acquiring comparable financial interests through synthetic means, like derivatives, options, or warrants.
That closes a significant regulatory gap. Without that provision, an official could avoid formally issuing a coin, but still profit by purchasing options on a specific token right before an agency announces a favorable regulatory policy.
Merkley also wrote a specific legal mechanism into the text to bypass potential defenses. Here is the quote: "For purposes of any immunities to civil and criminal liability, any conduct relating to a prohibited financial transaction under this section shall be deemed an unofficial act and beyond the scope of official duties."
He is establishing by statute that hawking a non-fungible token cannot be shielded as an official act of the presidency or a member of Congress. The goal is to preempt any immunity claims before they ever reach a courtroom.
The enforcement mechanisms are split. On the civil side, the Attorney General can sue violators for up to 10% of the asset's value or the total financial gain, whichever is higher. The violator also has to disgorge all profits to the Treasury.
The criminal penalties apply to knowing violations that cause at least $1 million in financial harm or result in personal gain. Those carry fines and up to 5 years in prison. There are also specific bribery clauses designed to disqualify individuals from holding federal office.
The proposal does include exclusions. The text clarifies that the ban does not apply to the passive holding or public trading of assets that are routinely accessible to the general public.
The timing of this push is connected to the wider debate over market structure bills. Congress is actively writing the regulatory framework for digital assets right now. Merkley is trying to ensure the people writing those rules do not have a financial stake in the outcome.
That dynamic extends directly into the second half of this legislative package. Amendment 4682 updates the Commodity Exchange Act to regulate event contracts.
These are prediction markets where users bet on real-world occurrences. The amendment states flatly, no covered individual may purchase, sell, or otherwise exchange an event contract.
Under this amendment, members of Congress are entirely banned from the practice. For senior executive branch officials, the prohibition is tailored to matters where they participate personally and substantially through their official duties.
Event contracts effectively allow individuals to monetize inside knowledge of the legislative process. If a lawmaker knows a committee chair is going to unexpectedly shelve a prominent bill, they could take a position against that bill's passage on a prediction market before the public finds out.
To enforce this globally, Merkley targets the trading platforms themselves. Foreign boards of trade must submit quarterly reports to the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, detailing any trades by United States covered individuals.
Failure to report those trades gives the CFTC the authority to revoke the platform's registration.
The amendment also directs the CFTC to issue new rules restricting the use of material non-public information in these markets. The legislation ports insider trading laws directly into the event contract space.
Both amendments are currently ordered to lie on the table. Finding standalone floor time for ethics legislation is notoriously difficult, which explains why Merkley is attempting to attach them to S. 1383.
That structural bottleneck often forces lawmakers to make a choice. They can wait for the committee process, or they can abandon the usual procedures entirely. Which brings us to a senator who decided to break ranks, leading directly into a defection from the partisan machine.
Exactly. When the usual procedures gridlock, lawmakers either wait it out or they abandon the machinery entirely, which is exactly what Independent Representative Kevin Kiley of California just did.
On March 19, 2026, Kiley went to the floor to announce a formal break from the two-party system. He asked the clerk to update his designation in all official House databases to independent.
A sitting House member dropping their party mid-session is incredibly rare. The House operates on strict majority-minority lines. You typically need a party apparatus for committee assignments, floor time, and even office budgets.
He acknowledged that reality, but argued the system is failing its basic obligations. Here is his rationale from the record. I have been critical of partisanship in Congress, from the longest government shutdown in U.S. history to an epidemic of gerrymandering that is spread from state to state.
He is diagnosing a structural failure. He is arguing that nationalized party fights are preventing basic local governance.
To prove that point, he spent his remaining floor time entirely on highly localized, bipartisan policy. He highlighted the Save Our Sequoias Act, a bill that creates a comprehensive reforestation strategy and expedites environmental reviews to protect giant sequoias from wildfires.
He also pivoted to education, specifically the Science of Reading Act of 2026. This legislation restricts federal literacy funding from being used on whole language or 3-cueing instruction methods.
Right. Kiley noted California has the highest illiteracy rate in the country, and he wants a strict return to phonics. I will read you his exact phrasing. Reading has to be taught in a very explicit way. That is what the science of reading is all about.
He capped his speech with a granular breakdown of California gas prices, pointing out the state average was $5.56 a gallon. He specifically targeted state-level cap-and-trade regulations and specialized fuel blending requirements.
Forest management, phonics, and fuel blends. He deliberately chose administrative, pragmatic issues over ideological wedge topics.
The test now is survival. Without party leadership backing him, finding floor time for those pragmatic issues is about to get significantly harder.
We will be watching to see how the steering committees handle his seat assignments in the coming weeks. And that is going to do it for us today on Floor Notes Extended.
Actually, before we sign off, it is worth pausing to appreciate the ultimate irony of this situation. In an era where members routinely build massive fundraising operations around their refusal to compromise, we finally have a representative risking their entire political career to take a hardline, anti-establishment stance on phonics.
A true maverick, bravely going rogue for early childhood literacy. It makes you wonder what scandalous topic they'll tackle next. Unanimous consent for pothole repair?
Let's not get carried away, Paige. Municipal asphalt funding is a highly contentious wedge issue in at least 3 swing districts.
That's Floor Notes Extended for today.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Keep an eye on those steering committee rosters, and we will catch you later this week.